Not recording that whole intro. So I'm going to start at the University of California, Berkeley. In the early 1970s, UC Berkeley, or any city in the US for that matter, was difficult to navigate for anybody in a wheelchair, specifically the sidewalks and curbs. It was at UC Berkeley one night in 1972 where students decided as an act of protest to pour cement into the form of a crude ramp. Despite being super uneven and actually taking a lot of momentum to get up, the makeshift concrete ramp provided much needed mobility for disabled students on campus. For those of you who don't know, a curb cut is a solid, usually concrete ramp sloping down from the surface of a sidewalk to that end of a adjoining street. It's interesting because I actually really noticed this when I was in New York recently, that they don't have standards for the way curb cuts are made. And so you're very likely to trip as you're walking, especially if you're used to the way that we do things here in Canada. But pressed by activists in the same year, Berkeley installed its first official curb cut at an intersection on Telegraph Avenue. Hundreds of curb cuts followed, and then hundreds of thousands all across the country. Curb cuts, which are meant for wheelchair users to get on and off sidewalks, help all sorts of people. They aid cyclists, people with strollers, delivery people, and even those who aren't paying attention because they're looking at their cell phones. Like me in New York. So this phenomena is what's known as the curb cut effect. It's a common term. Essentially, the things that are intended to benefit people with disabilities wind up benefiting everybody. What this means is making an accessible experience can often lead to a better experience for everyone. And this concept can also be applied when building accessible experiences online. Similarly, closed captioning, which was originally meant to benefit the hearing impaired, helps anyone who has trouble processing auditory information. This includes people watching television in a noisy place, or for people like me who just love watching terrible UK reality television and have a hard time understanding certain accents. I don't know if anybody knows who Kim Woodburn is, but these types of innovations help everyone, not just those with disabilities. So meeting the needs of online shoppers includes those with varying physical and cognitive abilities. And in my talk today, we're going to talk about how our teams at Shopify, our experience in building accessible storefronts, and how the majority of cases, an improvement in the name of accessibility ends up benefiting all users. So you, as a developer, a designer, or a PM, might already be feeling energized about building the accessible web. How many people are energized? Yay, okay. Maybe you understand its importance for your end users, or you have a legislative concern because you work at the university or for the government. Maybe you're driven by building inclusive experiences, period. Whatever it is, you're ready, and now the real work actually starts. But figuring out how to get started can be a daunting task. How do you start ramping up on knowing what's expected of an accessible website? Do you read blog posts, community guidelines, ask users? Well, if you've been thinking about web accessibility for even a short while, you've probably heard of WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. The goal of WCAG is to provide a single shared standard resource for web accessibility. So that sounds like a great place to start. However, when you start to read, it can quickly become overwhelming for any person or team new to accessibility. This is a checklist with its many practical examples, test criteria, and suggested techniques, which is fantastic. But it's totally natural to feel some confusion when you encounter the criteria for the first time. For example, multiple ways. More than one way is available to locate a web page within a set of web pages, except where the web page is the result of or step in a process. I feel like this could make anybody question whether or not they really understand what's being asked of them. WCAG, specifically WCAG 2.0, is considered the gold standard for accessibility. But it's not your only option to start learning what makes an accessible website. The WebAIM organization, for example, provides a list of recommendations that map to WCAG criteria. In their own words, they're striving to provide a simple checklist that focuses on HTML applications. Alternatively, the ALI project, in an open source effort to make it easier to implement accessibility on the web, or A11Y for short, is an acronym commonly used for the word accessibility. The ALI project has different patterns, technical demos, resources to help you understand different disabilities, as well as suggested events to attend and learn more about accessibility. In fact, when you start looking around for resources on the web, you quickly become inundated with blog posts and podcasts and YouTube channels, online courses, all providing valuable insights on implementing accessible practices. But this question of how to start comes full circle. Even with all these resources at our disposal, how does a team actually begin making their work more accessible? And that's the position our themes team found themselves in last year. For context, we maintain 10 uniquely designed and coded themes, and we were looking for a clear path to start assessing how accessible each one is. And in looking at each one on its own, as you guys also maintain themes and Drupal sites, you're assessing at least, in our case, 20 different templates, from the homepage to a blog to product pages. And in looking at each one on its own, each page is made up of different components. A navigation, which has drop-down menus, image galleries that might be interactive, search forms that are animated and maybe redirect a user to a new page, and products forms whose content dynamically updates as the shopper interacts with it. Once you start mentally adding up all of these different things and seeing all of the work ahead of you, you immediately might ask yourself, can I get a machine to do this? We're smart people, right? So the first thing that pops into most of our heads is, especially for developers, is how can I automate this? When it comes to accessibility, tooling can be a great place to start, especially if you've never done any kind of accessibility work before. One amazing tool is Lighthouse. Lighthouse is an open source automated tool for improving the quality of web pages. It has audits for website performance, accessibility, and more. It's built by Google, and you can find it in the Chrome Developer Tools panel under the Audits tab. Here you can actually check off what you want to include in your audit. In this case, we're auditing for accessibility. And after a few seconds, it will return back to you a detailed report. Axe is another open source rules library for accessibility testing. It differentiates itself from other tools in that it presents only what it deems to have a 0 false positive rate. The point is to ensure that the warnings and errors that it does point out are always relevant. You can install it as an extension, and it shows up also in the Developer Tools panel. Additionally, both of these tools can be built into automated workflows, like continuous integration. For those of you who don't know what continuous integration is, it's often referred to as CI. It's basically a development workflow which requires developers to merge their code into a shared version control repository. And then before merging, each merge request is verified by an automated build process. So kind of like a list of tests that it has to go through and checks that it has to go through before you're actually allowed to merge your code in. Think of it like an automatic set of tests that runs every time somebody saves their code or tries to save their code to the place that it's shared from. So using continuous integration in this way, essentially you have a machine checking your work for you, which can be super helpful. Some of the things that these tools audit against include, but aren't limited to, proper attributes on HTML elements. For example, images that have alt attributes on them, color contrast, which analyzes body text against its background color, HTML structure and usage, which ensures valid HTML tags are present, and area attributes that follow best practices. So I just mentioned something called area. So what does that mean? You'll often, if not already, hear the term or acronym area as you learn more about accessibility. Y area, or however you want to pronounce it, stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's a specification published by the W3C on how to increase the accessibility of web pages and more specifically dynamic content. Basically, the specification is comprised of area roles, states, and properties that are to assistive technology as CSS is to HTML. So for screen reader users, area dictates the rendering of the non-visual experience. Incorrect area might misrepresent experiences, so it's important to fully understand how to use area before implementing them in your markup. And by markup, I just mean code. In the few code examples that I show in this talk, I mention area attributes, and they look a lot like this, right? They usually start with the word area and then specify a role or a type. Then the attribute itself is set to equal a value. In this case, it's set to false. An area attribute, in this case, is applied to an opening HTML tag for an element, and by placing the area expanded attribute on it and setting it to false, I'm indicating that this mobile menu might actually be closed to a person who's non-sighted. So an area role is a promise to a user, and using a role without fulfilling that promise can be problematic. This comes directly from the area documentation, and it describes the importance of using proper area attributes. It's actually from a chapter called No Area is Better Than Bad Area. Another option for tooling, specifically from a Drupal perspective, is to consider using a parent theme that has accessibility baked right in, right? And making any additions or customizations using a subtheme. The Web Experience Toolkit is available for Drupal 8, and the original toolkit is a collaborative open source project led by the Government of Canada. It conforms to a CAG 2.0 AA standard, which is a standard required for all federal government, is a standard required for the federal government by all of its public-facing sites. And it leverages area to further extend accessibility. Fun fact, there's several people in the audience and also the IT person that's running around making the presentations working that have contributed to WET for Drupal 8. Anybody in this room contributed to WET? I was just checking the commit history last night and somebody committed to it last night. Or yesterday, I guess. There's also Bootstrap, which is originally created by a designer and developer at Twitter. And Bootstrap has become one of the most popular front-end frameworks and open source projects in the world. Depending on your implementation, it's completely possible to use Bootstrap for Drupal 8 to create websites and applications that fulfill the WCAG 2.0 requirements, so long as it's been implemented correctly. And that goes for anything, right? You can break all of this stuff if you really want to. Bootstrap is relatively generic, so it's important to note that authors might actually need to include further area roles and attributes in their code, as well as JavaScript behavior, to ensure that their components and things render with accessibility in mind. But remember, tooling has its limits, and we can't automate everything, unfortunately. These tools are great at what they do. They look at a static site and show markup errors, or they provide a starting point to build accessible applications and websites. But remember, websites aren't static. They move, they resize, they reflow, and they do things. And so we need to think about the user experience and what it's actually like to use a website, instead of just looking at what exists and what doesn't in the markup. Looking at this theme, there's an issue with this design, and it's the kind of error that automated tools wouldn't catch. The price, which is shown in gray, is breaking a guiding principle of accessibility, that color alone is not enough to convey meaning. Now, in reality, the product page doesn't actually look like this. It looks like that. And we're actually striking through the text because, first of all, that would be super confusing otherwise. But an automated tool wouldn't be able to know what the text is for, right? And that the text is supposed to indicate what the original price is. And so tests would have passed and you would have gotten a thumbs up because there's high enough color contrast there. By not relying solely on color alone to convey meaning, we can help users that might be colorblind or have low vision. And over time, people's vision fades. It can be affected by things like cataracts. So these groups have difficulty discerning colors and are therefore at a disadvantage when interpreting certain designs. But in addition to those groups, it's also a quick win to show the discounted price clearly to anybody viewing the product, right? I'm trying to highlight a realization our teams had when they started making our own themes more accessible. Automated tooling can tell you about the markup in your browser, but it can't tell you about the experience your users have and that you're delivering. This was a turning point for us in deciding how to audit our own themes. So if you want to create an accessible experience, then you have to think about the user's journey from beginning to end. Beginning to end. It's backwards when I'm up here. Findings from automation are great, but they're standalone items devoid of context, right? And one improvement early on in a journey can quickly be negated by something later. So our team started thinking about auditing not pages, but tasks. What's the main task for somebody visiting an online store? It's most likely completing a purchase. So what are the tasks an online shopper actually is trying to complete, and what are the steps along the way? Completing a purchase, for example, has a number of steps. I already covered one consideration when viewing products by not relying on color alone. But let's go to the next step of completing a purchase and talk about some accessibility concerns when browsing a product's many options. So there's something inaccessible about the way these product variant selectors are set up. So the way that you can select lenses or frames. These drop-downs don't have a visible label. Right now, there's no way of knowing what's going to be black and what's going to be orange. A common solution that I see has two steps. The first is that you put the label as the first option in the drop-down menu. And then two, the area labels are applied to the input. Screen readers would announce that the labels are there, and an automated tool would give you a thumbs up. But that's not a great experience. When you look at this design, it puts certain groups at a disadvantage. How many of you in the audience right now are trying to recall which drop-downs are frames and which are lenses? How many are doing a frantic process of elimination to the glasses beside before I change the slide? What you're experiencing is the same thing a number of your users are feeling. A visible label greatly reduces the mental burden when browsing a product's options. So who does this benefit? A visible label helps groups with certain cognitive impairments or difficulty concentrating. But as we already established, a visible label is useful for everyone, right? If you had to turn away from your phone to get your credit card or answer a text, coming back to the product page of your site shouldn't actually feel like starting over. I mentioned this before, but product pages often have dynamic content on them, images and text that change based on our interactions. In this video, changing product options will first update the amount of stock available from 3 to 1, and then later the add to cart button switches to sold out, depending on the item that's selected. These changes are apparent to a sighted user, right? But people who are blind or have low vision might not actually know that something's changed on the page. Those shoppers should also be available, or should also know when a price changes or availability changes as well. And we need a solution for people who rely on a screen reader when using the internet. We can use something called Area Live, and we can use Area to work with screen readers. In this case, Area Live tells a screen reader that certain content may update in the future, and when it does, to tell the user. This is often referred to as a live region. In practice, it looks like this. We wrap the price and availability in an HTML element with the Area Live attribute, and I set the value to polite so updates are announced, but won't interrupt other messages that are being read out to a user. Now, when the text changes from 3 available to 1 available, the screen reader will tell the user that the text has changed. So this is a video with voiceover on. Find a seat, no worries. And what's shown in the gray box is read out loud to a non-sighted user. This is on a Mac, so you can just turn voiceover on your Mac to simulate the same thing. When I switch from khaki to moss, you'll see that the new availability is announced. So using live regions is a consideration for people who rely on screen readers. When shopping online, they want to know just as much as anyone else if certain products are becoming more or less expensive, or if they have to act to grab the last one left. And to grab the last one left, you have to add it to your cart. And this is the next step in our key task. So when you click on the Add to Cart button, it might open a cart drawer, and our item is actually added to the cart, as this video demonstrates. But not everybody uses a mouse to navigate online. People who are visually impaired might rely on a keyboard or braille display, and others might not actually have the fine motor skills to easily use a mouse. How many people here navigate using their keyboard if they can, developer-wise? I'm sure a lot of the developers switch between programs. So if you're not using a mouse, then focus styling and the focus ring actually show you where you are on the page. What this means is it's really important to make sure that any interactive elements on your page have focus styling, because keyboard users rely on it. So let's navigate using the tab key, and when we tab to the Add to Cart button and hit enter, the same action should happen as when we click on the Add to Cart button. Keyboard focus is then moved to the drawer, and the next tab key press actually sets the focus on the close button. When building drawers like these, or menus for that matter, it's important to make sure that the close button is actually inside the focus drawer. That way it can be easily tabbed to, right? Having the close button as a focusable item inside the container makes for a better user experience. Then people can easily dismiss a drawer or a pop-up. It's also super helpful to provide people the ability to close on press of the escape key. So when building drawers like these, it's important to make sure that the close button is actually inside the focus drawer. That way it can be tabbed to. Having a close button as the first child in the HTML element, inside the container, makes for a better user experience. Then people can easily dismiss that thing. When someone's navigating with the tab key, we have to preserve the meaning and operability of web page content. This is what's known as focus management. In the most recent version of WCAG, there's a chapter about avoiding keyboard trapping. If focus is moved to a component of a page via keyboard, then that focus should also be able to exit that component also using the keyboard. This doesn't necessarily mean that trapping focus is a bad thing, so long as you make sure to give someone a means of exiting that focus. So right now, my focus is actually trapped in this drawer. When I hit the tab key, I loop through the focusable elements over and over, and I can choose to exit by selecting the close button and hitting enter. This provides me with a means of exiting that trapped focus using the same navigational tool I entered in with. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. So to trap focus within an element like this, you're going to have to write some JavaScript. There's no out-of-the-box way to do this. However, strong focus management helps both keyboard users with a range of abilities as well as the visually impaired. It ensures that their experiences are similar to those who are using a mouse or to navigate online. Remember, people can choose not to use a mouse. There are many tasks that are actually just faster using a keyboard. For example, closing windows or switching tabs. Those things are a lot easier to do with a keyboard than a mouse, and trying to find a tiny little Apple minimize button when your screen resolution is set to Retina. I know for myself as a developer, I've become used to using keyboard shortcuts when navigating interfaces, and great focus management and keyboard support is important for any user. No one should be confused when pressing enter doesn't submit a form. There's one final step to consider before we reach the end of our key task, and that's some users might actually want to modify their cart before they check out. So let's modify a cart on mobile using a touch interface instead of a precise focus state. All of a sudden, this design places a user at a disadvantage. When I put my thumb over the input, this is what I see, or what I don't see. Even though I don't suffer from a motor impairment, I still risk clicking the subtract button and clearing my cart by mistake. Whoops. So according to the material design guidelines, touch target should be at least 48 pixels by 48 pixels. That way, a 10mm finger pad can easily use them. The WCAG recommendation is actually a little bit smaller than that. It's 44 by 44 pixels. And touch target size should always be a consideration for mobile design. However, this doesn't mean that the icons themselves in a design need to be a minimum size of 44 by 44 pixels. Rather, the touch targets do, right? And we can do this with CSS really easily. An accessibility change does not always mean that you have to change the design. Instead, designers and developers should work together to build accessible experiences for everyone that look and feel great at the same time. Touch target size is not only a concern for those using mobile devices, but laptops with touchscreen are commonplace. How many people have a laptop with a touchscreen? This man with cerebral palsy has difficulty with fine motor skills, but a large touchscreen makes it a lot easier for him to interact with applications. Thinking more about the actual device brings up some new opportunities, right? In this theme, when you modify the cart quantities, the phone brings up the number-only keypad, not the full QWERTY one. And the number pad has much larger touch targets, which is an added benefit. And it's actually really simple to implement. All you need to do is include the appropriate attribute of type and set it to number. That's it. There are specialized keyboards for telephone numbers, emails, dates, and even search results. And by using the correct input, you're optimizing the user's experience and requiring them to do less typing. And that's something that everybody wants, right? This is a great example about how one small change made in the name of accessibility can actually be a big win for the overall user experience of your site. So I've been showing you guys how our designs can benefit people that may experience a variety of disabilities: hearing loss, trouble concentrating, motor impairments, low vision. But there's a group that's known to experience all of these things, and that we should all be thinking about. And this group is actually mentioned right in the WCAG guidelines, and that's as people get older, their abilities change. Someone who once had no problem using a mouse can develop arthritis. Someone's vision can blur over time because of cataracts. And who gets older? You do. We all do, actually, right? So when we build more accessible websites, we improve the experience for our current users, how they may change in the future, and also for ourselves. Thinking about accessibility as a concern for older users was initially brought to my attention at another conference in Toronto by a man named Makoto Yuki. He's the chairman of the Web Accessibility Infrastructure Committee in Japan, and he has a unique interest in older users of the internet. Japan has the oldest average population in the world, with over a quarter above the age of 65, an age group that's expected to continue to grow in the coming decades. But there's something else that's interesting about this group. Approximately 70% of Japanese over the age of 65 use the internet. A growing trend from years before, and a trend that we can see across all age groups. When you look around the world, you see the exact same trend repeated. In the United Kingdom, over recent years, the number of women aged 65 to 74 using the internet went up from less than half to 75%, the largest jump in any age group. And here in Canada, an estimated 81% of Canadians aged 65 to 74 are actively using the internet. Thinking back to the first responsive projects that I ever worked on and how we had to convince the university that responsive design would be a standard in the future, we were future-proofing our work. You wouldn't make a website that's desktop only now, right? Hopefully. Everyone expects a website that you build them to be responsive and work everywhere because everyone has a smartphone on them now. And so it's no longer this addition that we tack on to things, right? But it's a requirement for the work that we do. My hope is that as time goes on, we think about accessibility as a requirement, not something to be considered at the beginning of a project, not something to be considered at the end of a project, right? But something that we consider at the beginning of a project and how we build that project from the start. Just like a responsive website, accessibility is much easier when you build it from the beginning. I don't know if anybody has tried to do media queries from desktop down, but it's significantly harder than mobile first. If you're going to leave this session with just one takeaway today, I want it to be that an understanding of making sites or experiences or tasks more accessible is rarely benefiting some small subset of the population. A more accessible website will create a better experience for multiple groups of people across a range of abilities for both today and forward into the future. And that person in the future could be a friend, could be a parent, or it could be you. Thanks. There's 5 minutes questions.
So question about WCAG 2.1. So I've been hearing about it at work, and we're supposed to get training soon. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important and if you see any sort of adoption coming?
I would say, like anything on the internet, it's important to be aware of things that are coming in the future. I think you need to be realistic with what the requirements are for your company, but also just be aware of like what's coming down the line, right? If you go and look at the 2.1 spec, there's actually some changes, but there's not a huge number of changes yet, right? So if you're following that specification, it's a lot easier to like add those things to your brain as you go. But in terms of like me actually like using 2.1 or like trying to build for 2.1, I haven't yet. It's one of those things where like you kind of just sort of follow, and then once the requirement is there, you might do it, or you might start implementing some smaller things that are maybe easier at first. But in certain cases, you just have to see whether or not it's feasible for you. Yep.
You mentioned a pixel size for touch on the screen.
Yes.
Does that vary depending on whether it's handheld or a big screen? Is there a responsive aspect to that?
I would say the minimum touch target size is a minimum that's specified based on the size of your finger. So in theory, it shouldn't change. However, when you're building responsive sites for different size screens, it's important to remember how close somebody's going to be viewing that screen, right? So something that people often forget or often don't think of are like televisions, right? We don't really have great browsers yet in televisions, and maybe that will change in the future. But thinking about what your website looks like on a huge screen makes a huge difference. And it's not actually that the content doesn't change. It should actually get bigger on larger screens because people are going to view them from further back. So it's an interesting thing to think about. But I would say in terms of like actual touch targets, depends on the device that you're kind of thinking of. But for the most part, the size of your finger doesn't scale. So. I don't know. It's like for a large touch screen, like a Microsoft thing, like you might use your whole hand, right? So it depends what you're building for. One more question, and then you need at least a minute to run to the other room.
Photo. And photo. We're about 10 minutes behind. It's not a big deal.
Yes.
With the rise of voice assistants,
Yeah.
Alexa, Cortana, that sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
those kind of bring in the accessibility part
Mm-hmm.
and the normal use part.
Yes.
How do content like Drupal and content management systems account for that? And do they talk to each other?
I have no idea. I'll be completely honest. I have no idea. It's an interesting thought, and I think something that I would look into. But it's one of those things where I think if you're following, like all of these systems are built by companies like, say, Google, right, that maintain sort of the largest search engine. Right? So if you're building based on like the specifications that like by W3C specifications and like understanding like semantic markup and what renders properly inside Google, you're probably setting yourself up for success as long as you're sort of building towards those specifications that are built by and set by a group of people, right? And those are the people that are also kind of hopefully working within those organizations to build those products, right? So in theory, build for the specification, and then ideally Google follows the specification as well when they're trying to like pull content and that kind of thing. All right, thanks everyone. Feel free to like come talk to me. I'll be around. I'll be around all day. I have like a little appointment at 11, so I'm gonna run out for like half an hour, but I'll be back because there's definitely sessions that I want to see. Cool.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to keep this short and sweet. We have changed rooms for the strategy track. It is now in B0138, and that is reflected